Hello, hello, and welcome to the David Messiah YouTube channel, where our watchwords are to teach and to build back up the kingdom of Zion. And my name is Sidney Thomas. I'm the founder and the moderator of this YouTube channel. The title of the presentation today is Gog and Magog Defined. Gog and Magog Defined. And it is given in the form of an audio lecture, and I give in the description box below the link to that audio lecture, which is about a 2-hour lecture altogether in 2 parts. This transmittal video, which is what you're seeing now, in this I will only give a sort of a quick overview of what that talk is about and why why we motivated even to give this talk. So first of all, why are we even motivated to give this talk? It is because Gog and Magog is referred to very much so in prophecy. It's there certainly in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 39, where what is usually termed by commentators on end times prophecy as the World War III. This is where Gog and Magog are referred to essentially as the king of the north. In the recent video upload I've given, where I identify the king of the south as being Russia, I did have to make reference, obviously, to the king of the north and identified the king of the north, and therefore Gog and Magog as somehow being identified with that US, UK, NATO force projection formation, which indeed has been encircling Russia and having provoked it, Russia as a sort of king of the south of prophecy, essentially pushed back. And that was sort of prophesied would happen. That's there in the book of Daniel, chapter 11, verse 40. And arising out of that pushback, so to say, is what is now we see unfolding in that Russia-Ukraine war and the US, NATO, and UK response to that. Well, behind even US, UK, and NATO is Gog and Magog, because Gog and Magog is identified in Scripture as that essentially as that king of the north. But the term itself, Gog and Magog, is not defined in Scripture. So the point of this particular talk is to define Gog and Magog using linguistic tools to do so. Linguistic tools, and also using Urim and Thummim, even to get to the linguistic tools. Okay, and we find when we do that, that we have to go back to the paleo-Hebrew. Why? Because in the modern Hebrew, there are only 22 consonants. And the key consonants that are necessary to define linguistically exactly who are Gog and Magog are missing. And not by accident, because it's Gog and Magog in effect who are the perpetrators of that sort of call it I'm not sure cover up is the right word, but if you remove sort of the keys and the clues to getting to a better and a fuller understanding of Scripture and the terms that are used, well, it's a kind of a cover up. Okay. So this is the essential methodology that's used, Urim and Thummim, first to identify the paleo-Hebrew specification of those terms, and then having done so, to draw from it the conclusion as to who then it is referring to. All right, so that's the sort of methodological dimension of the problem. And what do we get? And let me just give a brief overview. I don't want to keep you sort of guessing and having, those of you who would rather not, those of you who would rather sort of jump to the conclusion and skip over all the tedious, well, not so tedious, I find it very fascinating, development to get to that conclusion, can at least know where it is they're headed. And where we end up is that Gog and Magog essentially is a reference to the city of London and the people that run the city of London, who are essentially the house of Rothschild, the whore. And it is not sort of by accident that HOR, House of Rothschild, is a homonym to the whore, WHORE, that is referred to in the book of Revelation as that figure that rides the beast, the red dragon with the 7 heads and the 10 horns. And it is that same red dragon that is referred to in the book of Revelation chapter 12, in that same chapter where the man-child that struggled to be delivered is also referred to. Okay, and let me just go quickly back to Revelation chapter 12, so the reference is clearly in view and in mind. Revelation chapter 12, verse 1, and there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. And she, being with child, cried, travailing in birth and pain to be delivered. This was the subject of the last video upload, dealing with signs and the coming of David Messiah. Because the child that pained to be delivered was that David Messiah. And then verse 3 and 4, which I skipped over the last time, is where now there's a reference also to the red dragon. So in verse 3 we have, and there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his head. And his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born. And then in verse 5, and she brought forth a man-child, who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. So in Revelation chapter 12, at the same time that there is prophecy as to the coming of that David Messiah, which was fulfilled on September 23rd, 2017, when the sign in the sky here prophesied was fulfilled. Right? The woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. That particular conjunction was there on September 23rd, 2017. And in the last video upload is where I talk about not only that particular sign and the date that goes along with it, but the sign of the Baptist lady preacher who came as I stood ready to preach on this subject on that date, circled me 3 times, muttering in trance, Isaiah, Isaiah, Isaiah. And then 2 months later, Isaiah appeared to me to let me know that I was that suffering servant. And so having let me to know I'm the suffering servant, it was a very, very short leap after that to come to the realization that that suffering servant indeed was the David Messiah. Well, in that very same Revelation chapter 12, attention is drawn to this red dragon. And elsewhere in Revelation, we know that that red dragon, okay, is ridden by the mystery Babylon, that whore. So this is where now Gog and Magog, in terms of who exactly is this Gog and Magog, this is where Gog and Magog are referenced, because ultimately they're the HOR, the whore, and the ones that control the city of London, that square mile area within larger metropolitan London, that even the Queen has to get permission to go there. Well, in that square mile London that is controlled by the whore, every year there is a ceremony where they drag out these two giant statues, one called Gog, the other one called Magog. And they have a ceremony and a little sort of a procession, and then they take the Gog and Magog back to where they would normally stand. Just like in ancient Egypt, every once a year you would bring out, Isis, and you'd bring out, Osiris, and you'd have a procession and blah, 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 and then they go back to where they normally reside. But the point is, the statues are called Gog and Magog, and it is there identified with the city of London. And the city of London, as we know, is controlled by the House of Rothschild, the whore. So that's who, and it is the House of Rothschild that basically controls that King of the North formation called US and NATO. So this is where we're ending up. But I look at it now from the linguistic angle. I go to the paleo-Hebrew, and there we find when you restore those consonants that were sort of, conveniently omitted from the 22 consonants that we now find in modern Hebrew, we find that that which is called Gog is actually a reference to a devil called Egyogo. Egyogo. And I suppose because of linguistic, ease, that phonetically drifts for simplicity to two different words, but it's the same referent. One word is goy, and the other word is Gog. But in either case, the referent is that devil called Egyogo. So that's who Gog is. And Magog, if you remember the prefix Ama, means child of. Magog, who is titularly or nominally one of the sons of Japheth, spoken of in the book of Genesis, chapter 10, he was actually the physical child of this devil. So that Egyogo was one of those fallen angels, a Nephilim. And his son, Magog, nominally the son of Japheth, was therefore what is also called in when we apply the same kind of linguistic analysis, called a gen, from which we get the word Gentile. The word gen is related obviously to the word egyogo, because even some of that gya letter is there in both. And gen literally in the paleo-Hebrew means son of the wicked one, because that letter Gah that has been removed from the modern Hebrew is depicted by a wick. Some see it as being a twisted rope, but a wick is a twisted thing, it's sort of plaited, and it is from which we get the word wicked. And also it is twisted. So two ways we know we're dealing with a wicked one. The wick symbolism and the twist symbolism. And on top of that, we use a wick and a lamp. So the destiny of a wick is to be burnt, isn't it? Which is also the destiny of the wicked and twisted ones. And Gog was one of the third part of heaven that joined Lucifer, whose Hebrew name is Hellel, meaning the bright one, in his rebellion. So there was a third of heaven, and all of them are of category devil, of category Satan, of sort of common descriptive category adversary, because they are against the order that was established by the Most High. And as Alistair Crowley let us to know very succinctly, if you like, the creed of those in rebellion is a very simple creed. It says, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." In other words, this is the creed of survival of the fittest. It's found their way into the evolution theory, that the fittest somehow survive, and those who are not fit to survive will die out. This is a dog eat dog sort of ethos of Babylon order. And this is what Gog and Magog, in terms of the false projection that it is brought upon the world, really, is seeking to do. It is seeking to dominate the world. Well, in the particular case now where Russia has perhaps, unbeknownst to itself, become the king of the South, is because, let me back up a little bit. House of Rothschild started out as money lenders. If you're a money lender on the street and somebody isn't paying, you bring to bear what is called kneecapping, or the threat of kneecapping. The threat of violence upon the person who is owing and who doesn't want to pay. This is the idea. You get a guy with a crowbar threatening to kneecap, this recalcitrant borrower. But he then ended up lending money to kings. Well, when you lend money to a king, how do you kneecap a king? You have to do it in a different way from how it's done on the street. But the principle is the same. You raise up a rival king to come against the king that doesn't want to pay you. Or else you contrive a revolution to bring down the king. And this is what the House of Rothschild has been doing. 18th, 19th, 20th century, continuing now into the 21st. So they've brought down a whole lot of kings, because they found it actually easier to establish these, republics, foisting upon the people ideas such as the rights of man, which was there underlying the French Revolution. Now, even before the French Revolution, they were involved in machinations involving Cromwell and so forth, under which they actually committed regicide upon King Charles I. Okay, so they have been in the color revolution business for a long time. They were the ones that brought about the communist, the Bolshevik revolution in Russia. That's when you had the Reds, the Red Revolution of communism, flying the red flag. Well, after the collapse of communism, now they're doing these other color revolutions. There's the Orange Revolution and the pink one, and this one in the Middle East, they call it the Arab Spring, because I guess the Arabs wouldn't budge from their green. I don't know why. But anyway, after, they're the ones that first of all, 100 years before Tsar Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, before he was killed by the Bolsheviks, he and his whole family. Tsar Alexander had foiled one of these schemes of the House of Rothschild, and they threatened at that time to kill the Tsar. And it was an intergenerational threat, which is what was then made good 102 years later, if I remember the exact sort of arithmetic on the time frame that was given. They you know, fulfilled that threat by killing Tsar Nicholas and bringing into being the Bolshevik Revolution. And they found it easier to deal with people who are less than kings, less than emperors, because kings and emperors sometimes have the temerity to think that they were put there by God, and the temerity to think that their duty is to protect the people. Whereas if you have some kind of a democrat in place, as part of some kind of a republic, he knows his time is limited. He may even have a term limit, no more than 5 years. He has to go back and get reelected. So such a person is much easier to control than somebody who is there for life because the Most High put him there. So they didn't like monarchies, and they spent the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries getting rid of all the monarchies that would stand in their way. Now I'm making that point in the context of Russia to suggest that having financed, because they came out of Wall Street with all the money that was needed to finance a communist revolution, which you would think it would be the sort of ideological anathema. They wouldn't want to finance some a communist revolution when they are there and owing their wealth to being at the heart of Wall Street and of the City of London, as bastions of capitalism. But if one country gets too big for its britches, so to say, the way to control that one is to raise up another one in opposition to it, so that you use the one now to threaten the other. So they were setting kings against each other right from the get-go. And now to have a communist revolution is just another sort of, manifestation of that basic strategy. Well, then at some point, as we all know, the Soviet Empire collapsed. But the basic project of drawing from that land its wealth was nevertheless, it was easier then to kind of pick apart the carcass of the collapsed Soviet Empire. And that's what the oligarchs at first were doing, because the oligarchs were also Gog and Magog. And they found it easy to do because they sort of organized it that way. Boris Yeltsin was a very compliant sort of first president of the collapsed Soviet empire in its successor state, which was then the Russian Federation. Russia is still, the largest country in terms of size of any other country on the planet. And as wealthy as one could imagine. But the wealth is there under the ground. So the oligarchs at first, with Boris Yeltsin sort of compliance, was grabbed up by those first set of oligarchs, who all tended to be of that same persuasion as the ones who had financed the Bolshevik Revolution from the beginning. But then Putin came and basically put a stop to that. And Putin came with the idea of the same kind of idea as Tsar Alexander And Tsar Nicholas, to a lesser degree, Tsar Nicholas was a little bit too laid back. He didn't quite see the threat that was there coming against him. But Putin essentially was trying to do for Mother Russia what a Tsar would do: protect his people and use the wealth of the land for the people, and oppose the kind of economic and financial rapine which was the project of the Gog and Magog, City of London, Wall Street boys. So once he came in and put a stop to that rapine, he became marked as an enemy of Gog and Magog. Okay, and that is how come, in effect, now when you go to that YouTube video where I talk about Russia being the king of the South, and making the particular point that in real seed line and ethnic terms, the core Russian ethnic identity is certainly not Gog and Magog, even though a major part, ethnic part of Russia, ancient Russia, and also certainly the Soviet Empire, was this a Bolshevik element which had taken over. Understand? But in biblical terms, ethnic Russia, ancient ethnic Russia, were Negro. And I mean it in the sense of um, when the Assyrian Empire came and scattered the northern kingdoms out of the land, Scripture records in the book of 2nd Ezra, chapter 13, verse 41, that the northern tribes scattered into lands where never before mankind dwelt. And they were Negro, being Israelite. So the Negro became the indigenous people of every land where before there was where mankind didn't before dwell. So they were the first to populate the Americas. They were the first to populate the Far East and South Pacific. They were the first even to populate far northern Europe, northwestern and western Europe. But everywhere that the Negro went, Edom, and later on also Gog and Magog were soon to follow. So it is in that sense, I mean, that ancient Russia would have been Negro. And it is there, when we look at the icons, that they were Negro people. But they whitened over time due to various mechanisms that I have addressed in other various videos, which I don't address yet now. So that if you look at the broadest of context, the whore that sitteth upon this beast, that is coming against the David Messiah and his people, which is Har Armageddon. The war of Armageddon is that war against the Negro, against the rise of Zion. That is the sort of broadest context. And when you look at who is this king of the north that we know is coming, who then is this beast that rides, this woman rather that rides this beast, this is the other woman, this is the woman, the mystery Babylon woman, that rides this red dragon with the 7 heads and the 10 horns. It is the whore, the house of Rothschild. Because they're coming for their pound of flesh, as it were. And they marked out Putin as public enemy number 1 because they want to bring back Russia under their control. But also they're going against China for the same reason. Because although they financed the Chairman Mao and his communist revolution, And also they financed the rise of China under Chairman Deng Xiaoping, who was the one that made all those reforms back in the late 70s and early 80s. Chinese Communist Party seems to want to do the same kind of thing that Putin is doing for Russia. Not that they wouldn't pay off the pound of flesh, but not to now where, in effect, the land belongs to the whore. You understand? So they're going to go against China as well. And this is what they have led the US now to do, along with its NATO force projection. So, in effect, identify Russia as an adversary and to identify China as an adversary. So they're trying to take down Russia, and also ultimately they want to contain and take down China. And for them, uh, it is a sort of a deadly game, because if they fail, it's their heads are going to be on the line. That is how serious this is for them. I mean, it's kind of incredible when you read recently, and I think I mentioned before, that the combined national debt of all the kings of the earth now, all the governments of the earth now, is about $266 trillion. Well, most of that debt is carried by the House of Rothschild. What more could they want? I mean, they'll never be able to spend $266 trillion. Okay, I don't care how many abandoned mansions that they build and abandon. They can't spend that amount of money, but it is a matter now of control. And if they lose that control, they lose their heads, basically. So that's how serious it is for them. And indeed, this is what is prophesied. So for them, it is existential, even though it seems the most normal people beyond even thinking. Why would they even be interested? Let Russia alone. Let China alone. Let the countries of the world trade in peace. Why war? Well, because that is the logic of the moneylender. Moneylender is not going to extract its pound of flesh from powers that consider themselves greater than the moneylender to whom they owe. And if the moneylender is not himself a state, he has to raise up states now to be the ones to wield that metaphorical crowbar to kneecap the state that doesn't want to comply. So this is what is going on. So this is where we end up in terms of identifying who Gog and Magog are. But the point of the lecture is to arrive at that understanding through sort of a linguistic analysis, which otherwise is impossible, because they have erased those clues, paleo-Hebrew clues that would let you know straight up from the scripture exactly what is the reference to Gog and Magog. So in effect, because Egyogo is one of those angels that aligned themselves or allied themselves with himself with Lucifer, in effect, when you see the reference in Revelation chapter 2 verse 9, I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Well, whether you say the synagogue of Satan or you say the Ama Egyogo, the people of the house of Egyogo, it's the same reference. Because ultimately, if they're serving Egyogo, God, they're also serving Lucifer. And this is admitted to by one of their number. There's a YouTube video that came out a long time back now by one Harold Wallace Rosenthal, where he admitted as such. And apparently, for that admission, he lost his life. So this is where we are, my brothers and sisters. The audio talk is altogether 2 hours in length. It's in two parts. The first part is about an hour and a half, and the second part is about 30 minutes. Those who only, of course, want the conclusion, well, they've got it. Now I've given it to them in this video, transmittal video. But I think it is also important to understand um, how how the definition arises linguistically, which is the point of the audio lecture. So it has been a pleasure for me to bring it to you, and with that, I give all praise, I give all glory, I give all thanks, I give all exaltation to the Most High, and to all who are listening, I say shalom.